The Emerald Tablets of Thoth The Atlantean. Who is Maurice Doreal? Part 3, Subpart 2. Here in Section 3, Part 2, we will go back in time to learn about the history and the process for interpreting, translating, and transcribing ancient texts, and compare this process to Maurice Doreal's experience of interpreting, translating, and transcribing his most popular book. We'll begin with an overview of Maurice Doreal's history, as well as his accomplishments and achievements. We will then examine information gathered from our sources in order to determine whether or not there are the instances for the evidence of plagiarism within Doreal's book entitled The Emerald Tablets of Thoth The Atlantean. Did Maurice Doreal capitalize on the pre-existing works of other occultists? So far, what we have learned about Claude Dodgins, also known as Maurice Doreal or M. Doreal, is that he was an occultist who had an interest in theosophy and the esoteric studies of the arcane, to include the metaphysical principles of Kabbalism and the spiritual principles of Gnosticism. According to research and information gathered from our sources, it appears that Maurice Doreal may have been influenced by the works of Helena P. Blavatsky, Manly P. Hall, G. I. Gurdjieff, P. D. Uspensky, Alice Bailey, and others who spearheaded the occult movement of the mid-19th to early 20th centuries. It is also possible that Doreal may have been influenced by the work of Athanasius Kircher, who chronicled his interpretations of Egyptian hieroglyphs in his book entitled Oedipus Aegypticus. Having been inspired by the popular occultists of his time, it would be over the course of his life that Doreal would accomplish three main things. Writer and author. Maurice Doreal wrote, authored, published, and distributed books, booklets, and pamphlets related to matters of the occult and the esoteric sciences. The overall focus and theme of his written works is dedicated to the spiritual development of man. Out of all the books that Doreal is said to have authored, The Emerald Tablets of Thoth The Atlantean is among the most popular. Builder and architect. Claiming to follow a directive given by the ascended masters of the Great Adepts, Maurice Doreal founded the Brotherhood of the White Temple, also referred to as Shambhala Ashrama. In accordance with the Universal Brotherhood of Man, he also established the Brotherhood Church. Collector and archivist. In addition to writing, authoring, publishing, and distributing his own series of books, Doreal is said to have amassed over 30,000 volumes of books and ancient texts related to the occult and esoteric sciences. Available in the online store on the Brotherhood of the White Temple website, the Little Temple Library is a collection of works written by Maurice Doreal and is comprised of 100+ booklets, pamphlets, and literature on various subjects related to the occult, as well as esoteric and metaphysical studies. Accomplishments, achievements, and speculation. Although Maurice Doreal achieved some level of notoriety for his personal achievements, as well as his contributions to the occult movement, there is some speculation surrounding the academic integrity and authenticity of some of his works. If you will recall from our source readings, we read several examples where Doreal may have gone so far as to attribute to himself concepts, ideas, and works that actually originated with others. Let's take a closer look at some of these examples and revisit key points from our source readings. Dodgins' wife expresses doubt. When Claude Dodgin divorced his second wife in 1937, he complained that she had denounced him in front of his disciples. Why would Dodgins' wife denounce him? What was the subject of her denouncement? Raising questions about imitation and plagiarism. In a source article posted on westward.com entitled Maurice Doreal and His Brotherhood of the White Temple, awaited the apocalypse from Colorado, contributing writer Charmaine Ortega Getz says, it's likely that Doreal borrowed his mystery wisdom home study model from the ancient mystical order Rosicrucis, an organization founded in 1915 by Harvey Spencer Lewis. Getz goes on to say that, to those familiar with the religion of Theosophy, founded by charismatic Russian Helena Blavatsky, Doreal's writings about the Great White Lodge and the Ascended Masters will seem curiously similar, if not an outright ripoff. To further underscore the fact that Claude Dodgins seemed to lack academic substance, Ortega Getz cites a statement of observation on the part of Walter Kafton Minkle, who researched Doreal for his 1989 book, Subterranean Worlds, 100,000 Years of Dragons, Dwarfs, the Dead, Lost Races, and UFOs from Inside the Earth, where the author is quoted as saying, Maurice Doreal produced a long series of repetitive, poorly written, but highly imaginative booklets on occult subjects. In addition to describing booklets written by Doreal as neatly typed, crudely stenciled, mimeographed on cheap paper, and stapled together, Ortega Getz states that, in appearance, the Emerald Tablets of Thoth The Atlantean was about as impressive as all of Doreal's other early works, though it's written in a far more enigmatic style. After reading Ortega Getz's description of Doreal's writing style within the Emerald Tablets of Thoth The Atlantean and comparing it to his other works, one is left with the impression that some obvious difference exists. I was curious about Ortega Getz's use of the word enigmatic to describe this departure in writing styles. From the Cambridge Dictionary, the word enigmatic is defined as follows. Enigmatic, mysterious and impossible to understand completely. From our source at Wikipedia, we learned that in 1925, Doreal claimed to have visited the Great Pyramids of Giza, where he discovered a set of ancient emerald tablets belonging to the Egyptian deity Thoth, whom he reimagined as a king of Atlantis. Some will find it rather curious that the writer posting this entry on Wikipedia.com just so happened to use the word reimagined to describe Doreal's interpretation and subsequent writing of the Emerald Tablets of Thoth The Atlantean. According to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, the word reimagine is defined as follows. Reimagine, to form a new conception of, to recreate, to imagine again, or imagine anew. So it would seem that we not only have an obvious difference in writing styles, but we are also confronted with the possibility that whatever was discovered or obtained in its original form may have been reimagined to be something other than it was originally intended to be. Because according to our review of another source, which happens to be a website by the name of Occult Mysteries, The Path to Light, it is as a result of investigative research into the validity of the material contained within Maurice Doreal's book entitled The Emerald Tablets of Thoth The Atlantean that the creator of the 12 Afterwards commentary demonstrates through comparative analysis how Doreal's book is actually a modified version of original ideas and concepts borrowed from other authors. The following is an example of how the content creator for the site compares a paragraph from Tablet 1, The History of Thoth the Atlantean, as it was interpreted and written by Maurice Doreal, to a paragraph contained within the book entitled The Secret Doctrine, written by Helena P. Blavatsky. The following are the examples. From Tablet 1, The History of Thoth the Atlantean, the author Maurice Doreal wrote, in obedience to the law, the word of the master grew into flower. Downward into the darkness turned the thoughts of the Atlanteans, until at last in his wrath arose from his Agwanti, the dweller. This word has no English equivalent. It means a state of detachment, speaking the word, calling the power. So now let's compare that to The Secret Doctrine, written by Helena P. Blavatsky. The sins of men have become so black that earth quivers in her great agony. 1 night and 2 days only shall the lords of the dark face live on this patient land. She is doomed, and they have to descend with her. The content creator for the 12 Afterwards commentary states, "It is clear from this where Doreal obtained his version of the destruction of Atlantis." The creator of the Occult Mysteries, the Path to Light website, provides numerous examples of comparison and analysis between the works of other authors, occultists, etc., and the work produced by Maurice Doreal. Now that we have reviewed several source examples related to the validity and authenticity of the Emerald Tablets of Thoth The Atlantean and their conclusions regarding the academic character and integrity of Maurice Doreal as the author of the book, let's take a closer look at another one of Doreal's accomplishments. Did Maurice Doreal actually build a large metaphysical library of rare, obscure books? According to the Brotherhood of the White Temple website, the only reference to a library that exists is the Little Temple Library, a collection of works written by Maurice Doreal that is comprised of 100+ booklets, pamphlets, and literature on various subjects related to the occult, as well as esoteric and metaphysical studies. However, from our source article located on the westward.com website, Charmaine Ortega Getz cites author Walter Kafton Minkle when he states, "Doreal amassed one of the world's largest and finest occult and science fiction libraries, over 30,000 volumes." After reading Walter Kafton Minkle's description of Doreal's occult and science fiction library, I am left with the impression that a large physical library exists, one that would be separate and distinct from the Little Temple Library that is only comprised of 100+ booklets written by Maurice Doreal, according to the Brotherhood of the White Temple website. When we conducted further research into the existence of a library large enough to hold 30,000 books, we found another information source that reiterates Kafton Minkle's description. The title of this web page is Claude D. Dodgen, aka Maurice Doreal, as a Fortean. The content creator for this website states, presumably throughout his life, but certainly in the 1940s, Dodgen was busy putting together a library. At its height, the library reportedly had some 30,000 volumes, an equivalent of the Manly P. Hall Library in California. The library apparently also had a lot of fantasy, as Dodgen was a fan of pulp fantasy from an early age. This particular source speaks to the existence of a library in a past tense term, as if once upon a time it may have existed but does no longer. The result of our own efforts to locate additional information with regard to such a library has netted 0 verifiable results. So it begs the following set of questions. If a library of this scale, housing 30,000 volumes of books, texts, documents, etc., exists, where is it physically located? If said library does not actually exist in physical brick-and-mortar form, is it possible that its archive exists online in electronic form? If so, where? In addition to the books, booklets, and pamphlets that Claude Dodgens, as Maurice Doreal, wrote, published, and distributed, from where and from whom did Doreal acquire such a collection of books that are said to have been amassed? On a final note, and at the last minute, I decided that I should visit the Manly P. Hall Library website before moving on to the next section in the series. And wouldn't you know? The title of this web entry is The Manly P. Hall Library, and the source is the Philosophical Research Society. Manly P. Hall, born 1901, and Maurice Doreal, born 1898 or 1902, there is some discrepancy as to his birth date depending on the source. They were both born around the same time, with both pursuing similar interests within the field of occult studies during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Mr. Hall outlived Doreal by around 27 years. According to the general information page of the website, Mr. Hall founded the Philosophical Research Society in 1934 and was its first president, remaining so until his death in 1990. Hall amassed an extraordinary collection of rare books and artifacts from his extensive travels. Manly P. Hall traveled extensively and assembled a magnificent library. Founded in 1934, the Philosophical Research Society is a repository of multicultural wisdom sources and a center of learning with a unique library containing over 30,000 rare volumes. Do key points within the general information page for the Manly P. Hall Library sound familiar? They should, because we just finished reviewing information from sources that we had cited about the existence of a library having been established by Maurice Doreal. Let's refer to this source once again and compare notes. From our source article located on the westward.com website, Charmaine Ortega Getz cites author Walter Kafton Minkle when he states, Doreal amassed one of the world's largest and finest occult and science fiction libraries, over 30,000 volumes. So it looks like Walter Kafton Minkle was either misquoted or he mistakenly referred to Maurice Doreal when he should have been referring to Manly P. Hall when he was quoted about the 30,000 volumes of rare books amassed within an impressive occult and science fiction library. Sometimes things get lost or inadvertently mixed up in translation. At best, it appears that the issue with regard to the existence of a library built and established by Maurice Doreal has been resolved. Let's move on to the next point in our research. Having reviewed questions with regard to Doreal's accomplishments and achievements, and the evidence which supports the notion that he may have copied and modified the work of others in the creation and development of his own works, we will now take a look at his works from another point of literary perspective. Deciphering, decoding, and interpreting ancient texts, books, and manuscripts. If you will recall from our readings in Section 1 and 2, we learned that in 1925, Claude D. Dodgens, or Maurice Doreal, claimed to have traveled to Tibet by way of astral projection. While in Tibet, he further claims to have been taught by the ascended masters of the great adepts who reside within a hidden underground kingdom in the Himalayas, learning and studying the mysticism of the occult and esoteric concepts for a period of 8 years. During the same year in 1925, Doreal claimed to have visited the Great Pyramids of Giza, where he is said to have discovered a set of ancient emerald tablets belonging to the Egyptian deity Thoth, whom he reimagined as a king of Atlantis. Once he was in possession of the tablets, Doreal then claimed to have translated the text and then transcribed the work by way of channeling the denizen of Atlantis, which he then published as the Emerald Tablets of Thoth The Atlantean. Now that we have summarized when, how, and the way in which Doreal was to have written the book, we want to compare his experience as an interpreter and translator to the experience of other interpreters and translators in order to better understand and appreciate the process of deciphering, decoding, and interpreting ancient texts, books, and manuscripts. Sometimes things get lost or inadvertently mixed up in translation. Throughout history, individuals have copied original works from original authors for the purpose of preserving and archiving the original content contained within an original work, such as books, manuscripts, documents, ancient scrolls, etc. It requires great skill on the part of individuals who undertake the task of deciphering, decoding, and interpreting written works that contain symbols, letters, and/or characters that may or may not have a current framework of literary reference. For example, a list or table of conversion that can accurately define a character or symbol and then convert it into a different language other than the one it was originally written in. The process of interpretation requires a high level of integrity, skill, and an intense level of focus on the part of the individual who is attempting to translate a work from one form to another. All the while, the goal is to ensure that they are preserving the original intent as it was intended by the original author, and to remain scrupulously unbiased during the process of interpretation, translation, and transcription. This is easier said than done. The greatest challenge as an interpreter or translator is to remain objective about the work being transcribed from one form to another. However, the chief difficulty lay in not allowing the personal bias of subjectivity to impact or affect the content of original intention for the work being translated. In order to demonstrate the challenges associated with the laborious and arduous task of deciphering, decoding, and interpreting ancient texts, we will read and review information from 3 online sources so that we can compare historically documented processes to Claude Dodgen's or Maurice Doreal process for interpreting and translating the Emerald Tablets. With that said, we'll take a trip back down the memory lane of ancient history to see how attempts at interpreting the original content of ancient works can easily get lost in the translation of personal bias. Let's begin. Historical processes related to the reproduction, preservation, and archiving of ancient texts. Our first source, posted on the History Stack Exchange website, is entitled, "Where Are the Ancient Books Now?" This particular entry gives us an introductory overview into the life of ancient scribes and the methods that were used in the interpreting and transcribing of ancient documents. In Roman Greek times, before 300 AD, there were no books in the Roman Empire, just papyrus scrolls, each chapter being one scroll. So a work like the Republic would be divided into many scrolls. Papyrus is relatively perishable, so virtually none of these scrolls survived, with only a few isolated exceptions. The works have survived, however, because they were copied either by individual scholars or by being copied en masse in scriptoriums. In a scriptorium, a master reader, called a lectorius, would recite the word, and scribes would write it down as he spoke it. Another method of copying, more precise, was to use the punct, a sharp stick. With the left hand, the copyist would place the point of the punct below the letter being copied and write it with the right hand. Then he would move the punct to the next letter and repeat the process. Our word punctillus comes from this process. Every library in medieval times had a scriptorium. They would borrow scrolls or books, copy them for their library, then send them back. Our second source, posted on the wikipedia.com website, is entitled Library of Alexandria. We'll begin by reading about the early expansion and organization of the library and their efforts to collect, interpret, and transcribe all books and literary materials that came into the ancient port of Alexandria. Every library in medieval times had a scriptorium. The Ptolemaic rulers of their time intended for the Great Library of Alexandria to be a collection of all knowledge, and the rulers worked to expand the library's collections through an aggressive and well-funded policy of book purchasing. Royal agents were dispatched with large amounts of money in order to purchase and collect as many texts as they possibly could about any subject and by any author. Older copies of texts were favored over new ones, since it was assumed that older copies had undergone less copying and that they were therefore more likely to closely resemble what the original author had written. This program involved trips to the book fairs of Rhodes and Athens. According to the Greek medical writer Galen, under the decree of Ptolemy II, any books found on ships that came into port were taken to the library, where they were copied by official scribes. The original texts that had been confiscated remained within the library, and the copies of these original texts were delivered back to the book owners. Our third source comes from a book entitled Libraries Before Alexandria, where the authors have documented the existence of ancient libraries long before the building of the Great Library at Alexandria. Ancient Egypt and Western Asia had a library tradition many centuries before the advent of the Greek script and the building of the Great Library of Alexandria. Here, the existence of libraries can be traced back another 2 millennia, from the 27th century BCE to the 3rd century CE, and so the creation of the library in Alexandria was not as much the beginning of an intellectual adventure as the impressive culmination of a very long tradition. The libraries in Egypt and Western Asia were centers of knowledge prior to the famous Library of Alexandria. Our fourth source, posted on the dartmouthcollege.edu website, is entitled Medieval Book Production and Monastic Life. This particular entry gives us a deeper level of insight into the process for interpreting and transcribing ancient works. We'll go back in time to the 4th century and read about the monastic life of monks and the various challenges that they faced in their roles as monastery scribes. It wasn't until the 4th century AD that the medieval world was introduced to monastic life in the form of a devout Egyptian Christian named Pachomius that thought it was a good idea to have an isolated space to be humbly miserable and to worship God at the same time. His concept spread rapidly throughout the Eastern Roman Empire, and with it, his expectation for all monks to be literate. About 200 years later, in 529 AD, Benedict established Monte Cassino, a soon-to-be famous Italian monastery close to Rome and Naples, and took literacy one step further than his predecessors. His Rule of Saint Benedict provides some guidelines for monastic life at Monte Cassino, including a section called On Daily Manual Labor, where reading is one of the compulsory activities built into a monk's very regimented schedule. Soon after, Cassiodorus founded Vivarium in South Italy and pushed for more than just idly reading texts. He made copying them yet another compulsory task. Suddenly, as per popular adoption of Cassiodorus Institute's rulebook, copying texts of all kinds became an important and highly pretentious part of life in monasteries. He saw copying biblical texts as spreading the message of the Christian religion and fighting with pen and ink against the unlawful snares of the devil, which seems as noble a purpose as any for devout monks to perform daily as part of their grueling manual labor. And trust me, it was grueling. The process. The process of medieval copying, however biblical or holy, was highly taxing. Cassiodorus' overenthused attitude about copying the good word was certainly not shared by the scribes that actually did the copying in monasteries, but that was in fact the point of manual labor. Cassiodorus pores over correct and precise copying techniques and suggestions on how to improve your grammar and spelling in institutes, showing just how detailed and systematic copying became during this time. Because of these close details, copying text required great skill and tons of training on behalf of the scribe, and finishing a single copy could take weeks, even with long hours devoted only to writing. A monastic scribe would work for at least 6 hours a day, and the best ones would work more than that. Cassiodorus specifically exempts the best from daily prayers so they may have more time to work. Those round the clock special scribes also graciously received an abundance of candles and a clock so they may work past sunset and watch their life slowly tick away while they toiled. A single room of the monastery, called the scriptorium, acted as the workshop for scribes and was usually isolated, mandatorily quiet, and not very comfortable. Monks who worked under these conditions frequently suffered from acedia, a foul darkness that causes the affected to act anxious, apathetic, and hopeless, as if the sun was too slow in setting. In other words, clinical depression. Often scribes would express their anguish in the margins of a manuscript they copied in the form of little pleas of mercy. One even writes, at the end of his script, "Now I've written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink." The unavoidable problems. The length of the text was far from the only problem for medieval monks tasked with copying. Since all manuscripts were copied by hand, some form of human error corrupts them, whether it is skipping over words or perhaps entire lines, misspellings, false interpretations, or hypercorrections. Even the best of scribes could easily succumb to any of these errors by accident, corrupting their manuscript without knowing, contributing to the confusion of present scholars trying to figure out what the original manuscript said. Because of the commonality of these errors, the exemplar the monk would copy his own manuscript, which could possibly contain major flaws, unavoidable in his own script, even if he himself made no mistakes. Of course, monasteries did their best to avoid all corruptions, implementing a rule that monks were only supposed to copy what they saw on the page and not try to correct the errors they may or may not have seen in their exemplar. But this did not protect them from all corruption, especially when monks didn't understand the text in front of them. Language barriers frequently separated a monk from his exemplar. A Latin-speaking monk may be asked to copy down a Greek text, but even if the text was in Latin, it was a very different form of Latin than what he would be used to. By the Middle Ages, the Latin language had regionalized and evolved into something that was nothing like the archaic Latin of ancient Rome, both in grammar and syntax, much like the difference between modern English and Middle English. Some people thought this was for the best. Poggio, a major and enthusiastic figure in copying culture during the Renaissance, believed that understanding the text was not favorable, as it would introduce the possibility of more hypercorrection errors because monks would feel more comfortable correcting their own language. This would make the manuscripts more precise in their readings, but may be dangerous if a scribe was unable to recognize if he himself made a major error in copying a foreign language. Past the physical pen-to-parchment copying of the production process was equally as difficult and specialized. Scribes, illustrators, and bookbinders would often be separate in their professions because of the level of skill and amount of time needed to adequately perform each part of the process. The scribe would copy a text, then hand it off to the illustrator, if there even were illustrations, usually only seen in later manuscripts, and then it would be given to a binder to be sewn together at last. This process took copious amounts of time as well, not just because the tasks in themselves are time-consuming, but the book also may have had to travel to different monasteries or workshops in order for illuminations or bindings to be completed. Monastic reading culture. Despite these literary pursuits majorly dominating monastic life, The reading culture present in monasteries was not a positive reinforcement of a love for the written word so forced upon the monks. Reading and copying were indeed treated as manual labor, and that added a negative connotation of an intense distaste for reading. Benedict's rule creates daily silent meals where no one was allowed to speak for any reason other than the weekly reader, the person in charge of mandating a certain holy book or other to the entire dining room. Even the weekly reader's enthusiasm for reading was crushed because the rule dictates that the reader should pray to God for salvation from pride in his important task of reading to the masses. The Carolingian Revival. Still, for some reason, monks kept on copying. From the start of the boom in copying practices in the 4th century AD, Greek and Latin mythical and literary classics were the predominant texts copied up until about the 6th century, when Christian texts started to replace them due to the rise of the Christian religion. Here, the Dark Ages of Greek and Latin literature descended upon ancient manuscripts, neglected on monasteries' library shelves, not to be copied because of newfound disinterest in them as compared to Christian texts. This neglect caused the older manuscripts to decay faster than they normally would because no one was particularly interested in their well-being. Some pagan manuscripts were even reused for writing new biblical copies down because of the high cost of parchment. The old ink would either be washed or more commonly scraped off, and the new text written over to create a palimpsest, literally Greek for scraped again. Most manuscripts from antiquity don't survive to the present day because of these and other natural causes. Some interest in pagan literature still survived, of course. In the Greek Byzantine Empire, where the people never truly stopped caring about their ancient mythology, but got close to forgetting about it for a while. What manuscripts survived only survived because of the strength of the papyrus or parchment they were written on until about the mid-8th to the early 9th century, when a classical revival took place. There was the Carolingian Revival, when the first Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne reinvigorated the learning spirit in monasteries across the empire. He recruited major scholarly figures and poets from around the world to gather at his palace, which became a center for scholarship with its vast library of Charlemagne himself. Monastic libraries once again flourished, and copying of Greek and Latin classics restarted, this time on an unprecedented scale under Charlemagne's reign. Illumination finally came into use, although very archaic, literally borrowing motifs from antiquity, at first with limited colors, but breaking out into elaborate designs seen in canon tables in copies of the Bible and colored initials to start the major lines of a text. Special scholarly editions of manuscripts also started to be published, with scholia, or commentary paratext, taking up stretches of the page longer than the actual text itself. The 9th century Renaissance in the Eastern Byzantine Empire mostly focused on this newfound scholarship, with the founding of literary and poetic groups and the refounding of schools in major cities. The Carolingian Revival is the single most important event in classical literary history because of this sudden extreme interest in classical texts that were copied and spread like wildfire. This single-handedly saved ancient texts, which do not have any surviving manuscripts from antiquity, making the Carolingian era manuscripts the only surviving and most important texts we have. It is because of those book productions in the medieval world that we have most of the Greek and Latin classics we have today, which just may validate all the hard work done by scribal monks living quietly in the far remote reaches of society so long ago. Now that we have finished reading information gathered from our sources, we will now conduct a summary and analysis and review key points related to the preservation and archiving of ancient texts. The ancient libraries of antiquity. Ancient Egypt and Western Asia had a library tradition many centuries before the advent of the Greek script and the building of the Great Library of Alexandria. The libraries in Egypt and Western Asia, to include Sumer, Assyria, Mesopotamia, Babylon, etc., were centers of knowledge prior to the famous Library of Alexandria. So, the creation of the library in Alexandria was not as much the beginning of an intellectual adventure as it was the impressive culmination of a very long tradition. The writing and rewriting of history in the making. In Greco-Roman times, original works of antiquity survived because they were copied either by individual scholars or copied en masse in scriptoriums. A master reader would recite the word, and scribes would write it down as he spoke it. During the expansion of the Great Library of Alexandria, royal agents were dispatched with large amounts of money in order to purchase and collect as many texts as they possibly could about any subject and by any author. Older copies of texts were favored over newer ones, since it was assumed that older copies had undergone less copying and that they were therefore more likely to closely resemble what the original author had written. Any books found on ships that came into port were taken to the library, where they were copied by official scribes. The original texts that had been confiscated remained within the library, and the copies of these original texts were delivered back to their book owners. The monastery scribes, who were the monks that toiled in the ancient scriptoriums. During medieval times, Cassiodorus pushed for monks within the monasteries to do more than just idly read texts. He made their copying of ancient texts yet another compulsory task. Copying texts of all kinds became an important part of life in the monasteries and was considered to be a grueling form of manual labor. The process of medieval copying, whether biblical or holy, was highly taxing. Requiring great skill and tons of training, monastic scribes worked an average of 6 hours per day, copying volumes of text which could take weeks. A single room of the monastery, called the scriptorium, acted as the workshop for scribes and was usually isolated, mandatorily quiet, and not very comfortable. Monks who worked under these conditions frequently suffered from acedia, a foul darkness that causes the affected to act anxious, apathetic, and hopeless, as if the sun was too slow in setting. In other words, clinical depression. Since all manuscripts were copied by hand, some form of human error corrupts them, whether it is skipping over words or entire lines, resulting in misspellings, false interpretations, or hypercorrections, corrupting their manuscript without knowing, and contributing to the confusion of present-day scholars trying to figure out what the original manuscript said. Monasteries did their best to avoid all corruptions, implementing a rule that monks were only supposed to copy what they saw on the page and to not correct the errors they may or may not have seen in their exemplar. However, this did not protect from all corruption, especially when monks didn't understand the text in front of them. Language barriers frequently separated a monk from his exemplar. During the Renaissance, some monastic promoters of copying culture believed that understanding the text was not favorable, as it would introduce the possibility of more hypercorrection errors because monks would feel more comfortable correcting their own language. They held the belief that this would make the manuscripts more precise in their readings, but may be dangerous if a scribe was unable to recognize if he himself made a major error in copying a foreign language. Scribes, illustrators, and bookbinders would often be separate in their professions because of the level of skill and amount of time needed to adequately perform each part of the process. The scribe would copy a text, then hand it off to the illustrator, if there were even illustrations, usually only seen in later manuscripts, and then it would be given to a binder to to be sewn together at last. The book also may have had to travel to different monasteries or workshops in order for illuminations or bindings to be completed. Everything that we think we know about history is wrong. Our history largely depends upon who is interpreting it. A comparison of process and approach. Now that we have completed our review of key points related to the preservation and archiving of ancient texts, how does Doreal's claims of using a form of channeling to interpret, translate, and transcribe ancient texts compare to the historically documented processes of interpretation, translation, and transcription as it were accomplished by scribes in ancient history? As we have learned, the act of translation is not an easy process. In addition to the amount of time and effort that is required to decipher, decode, and translate documents, manuscripts, books, etc., there is the additional expenditure of time and effort in the final interpretation and transcription of the end result. From our source readings, we have learned of Maurice Doreal's claims that he interpreted the Emerald Tablets by way of channeling Thoth. As a result, Doreal wrote and authored the book, The Emerald Tablets of Thoth The Atlantean. To get a better idea of the interpretive process that Doreal experienced, let's take a look at 3 different definitions for the word channeling. Our first source for the definition of the word channeling comes from dictionary.com, and channeling is defined as the practice of professedly entering a meditative or trance-like state in order to convey messages from a spiritual guide. Our second source is Collins Dictionary, where channeling is defined as, in some New Age beliefs, the process by which a person becomes a conduit for a deceased person as someone from an ancient culture who imparts information about a previous life. And then finally, our third source is the Free Dictionary, where channeling is defined as the act or practice of serving as a medium through which a spirit guide purportedly communicates with living persons. Although it is a very different approach as compared to the manual efforts of labor on the part of the ancient scribes to interpret and translate information, the idea or act of channeling, in comparison to the rigorous interpretive processes that the ancient scribes undertook, leaves one with the impression that the act of channeling is not as demanding or as arduous a task as evidenced within the ancient scriptoriums. That is not to say that channeling, as a form of metaphysical communication and instruction, doesn't have its challenges. It's just that the time and effort expended within both types of processes doesn't seem to equate. As it relates to the process of deciphering and decoding characters and symbols, the Emerald Tablets are said to be encoded with a series of unique characters and symbols encoded in the Atlantean language, and that they are engraved within and throughout a series of tablets whose material composition is of imperishable construction. At this point, it is important to get some perspective on what Doreal was said to have accomplished over the course of his lifetime. For this, we'll need to establish a frame of context as it relates to his activities within a certain period. We'll review once again the historical timeline of events and occurrences that we developed in Section 2, as well as a bibliographical history of the books Doreal wrote and published within a specified period in history. Let's begin. In 1902, Claude D. Dodgen was born in the month of August in Sulphur Springs, Oklahoma. In 1925, Claude Dodgen claimed to have visited the secret underground kingdom of the Ascended Masters in Tibet. In 1925, Claude Dodgen also claimed to have visited the Great Pyramid of Giza, where he discovered a set of ancient emerald tablets belonging to the Egyptian deity Thoth. Between 1929 and 1941, during the era of the Great Depression in America, Claude Dodgen worked as a clerk, a cab driver, a brokerage salesman, and a department store salesman. Between 1930 and 1932, Claude Dodgen established the Brotherhood of the White Temple. In 1933, an Oklahoma City directory listed Claude D. Dodgen's occupation as president of the Brotherhood of the White Temple. By 1935, Dodgen was described as a traveling minister who'd been a transient across country with no place of residence. In 1937, Dodgen divorced his second wife, complaining that she had denounced him in front of his disciples. In 1939, writing under the pseudonym M. Doreal, Dodgen published a book entitled The Emerald Tablets of Thoth The Atlantean. In 1942, the Brotherhood of the White Temple was officially incorporated in Denver, Colorado as a religious organization. In 1951, Dodgen relocated the Brotherhood of the White Temple to Sedalia, Colorado to escape the fallout of a nuclear holocaust. In 1963, Claude D. Dodgen died in the month of November, according to Colorado state records. We have now come to the bibliography and a partial listing of books written by Claude D. Dodgen, who wrote under the pseudonym Maurice Doreal, as well as the pen name M. Doreal. Our source is an entry entitled Maurice Doreal, located on the Kook Science website. The following is a listing of books that Doreal wrote, published, and distributed over a 14-year period between 1925 and 1939. In the 1920s, Spiritual Power Magnetic Healing was written in 1929. In the 1930s, Material in Harmony and How to Overcome It was written in 1937. Divine Healing was written in 1937. Pineal Eye was written in 1937. Personal Magnetism was written in 1937. The Four Planes of Healing, Guide for the Metaphysical Healer was written in 1938. The Emerald Tablets of Thoth The Atlantean was written in 1939. Asana, Breath, and Mantram, a complete course in the essentials of yoga, especially adapted for the Western student, was written in 1939. Historical frame of context related to Maurice Doreal's activities over the course of his lifetime. Questions and observations. Having reviewed the historical timeline of events and occurrences and a bibliographical history of the books Doreal wrote and published between 1925 to 1939, what can we conclude? In 1925, Doreal claims to have received a supernatural invitation to visit Tibet, where in a hidden underground kingdom of the Himalayas, he spent 8 years being taught by the ascended masters of the great adepts. In the same year, 1925, Doreal claims to have visited the Great Pyramids of Giza in order to retrieve the Emerald Tablets. In interviews with Time and Life magazines, Doreal was questioned about the lack of international passport stamps that could prove he had physically traveled outside of the U.S. As Doreal did not physically travel to Tibet, he responded by stating that he had traveled to the region by way of astral projection. Questions. At what point in 1925 did Doreal leave Tibet and travel to the Great Pyramids of Giza, located in Cairo, Egypt, on the African continent? International travel between different countries and continents requires the presentation of a passport book, which is stamped during a traveler's passage through a country's customs office. Where was the proof of a passport stamp for his travels to Cairo, Egypt, in Africa? Observations. Between 1925 to 1939, there are a total of 14 years between the time that Maurice Doreal claimed to have traveled to both Tibet and Egypt in 1925 and the year 1939 in which he published the Emerald Tablets of Thoth The Atlantean. Note: 14 years is more than enough time to decipher, decode, interpret, and translate the Emerald Tablets, and then write, publish, and distribute a book about them. Between 1929 and 1939, 4 years later, after claiming to have traveled to both Tibet and Egypt in 1925, Maurice Doreal would begin writing and authoring books, booklets, and pamphlets in 1929. Over a 10-year period from this point in time, he would write, publish, and distribute an estimated total of 8 books related to the occult and esoteric studies, to include the Emerald Tablets of Thoth The Atlantean in 1939. Between 1929 to 1941, 4 years later, after claiming to have traveled to both Tibet and Egypt in 1925, Claude Dodgen, also known as Maurice Doreal, would be employed in multiple roles in the United States beginning in 1929. Over a 12-year period from this point in time, he worked as a clerk, a cab driver, a brokerage salesman, and a department store salesman during the era of the Great Depression in America. Note: it appears that while Dodgens was employed in different roles with different companies over the course of 12 years, he was also working on writing, publishing, and distributing an estimated total of 8 books during this time period. Between 1930 to 1933, 5 years later, after claiming to have traveled to both Tibet and Egypt in 1925, Claude Dodgen, also known as Maurice Doreal, established the Brotherhood of the White Temple in 1930 as per the directive that he claims was given to him by the Ascended Masters of the Great Adepts. 8 years later, after claiming to have traveled to both Tibet and Egypt in 1925, the Oklahoma City Directory listed Claude Dodgens, also known as Maurice Doreal's, occupation as President of the Brotherhood of the White Temple in 1933. Note: at this particular point within the specified period of 14 years, Dodgen was not only employed in multiple roles with different companies, he was also writing, publishing, and distributing books, as well as forming the Brotherhood of the White Temple and becoming president of the organization. Between 1935 to 1939, 10 years later, after claiming to have traveled to both Tibet and Egypt in 1925, Claude Dodgen, also known as Maurice Doreal, was described as a traveling minister who'd been a transient across country with no place of residence in 1935. 12 years later, after claiming to have traveled to both Tibet and Egypt in 1925, Dodgen divorced his second wife in 1937, complaining that she had denounced him in front of his disciples. Questions: why would Dodgen's wife denounce him? What was the subject of the denouncement? Let's take a brief look at 3 definitions for the word denounce. From the Oxford English Dictionary, denounce is defined as to publicly declare a person or thing to be wicked or evil, usually implying the expression of righteous indignation, to bring a public accusation, to publicly declare to be wrong or evil, to condemn, criticize, or castigate, to inform against, to expose, incriminate, or implicate. Observations. Based upon the 3 different definitions and meanings for the word denounce, it appears that Doreal's wife may have been aware of some falsehood that he was promoting for opportunistic gain. And finally, 14 years later, After claiming to have traveled to both Tibet and Egypt in 1925, Dogen, writing under the pseudonym M. Doreal, would publish a book entitled The Emerald Tablets of Thoth The Atlantean in 1939. Conclusion. Spanning a 14-year period between 1925 to 1939, which culminated in his most popular book entitled The Emerald Tablets of Thoth The Atlantean, Claude D. Dogen, also known as Maurice Doreal or M. Doreal, was a very, very busy man. If you take into account all of the activities he is said to have engaged in or accomplished within a specified period of time in his life, and then combine these activities with the information and the evidence collected and gathered from our sources about how Maurice Doreal may have borrowed and copied from the works of other occultists and authors, one could only conclude what exactly? Maybe we should be looking at the obvious from another angle, a different dimension of perspective, perhaps. If you will recall from the source we cited at Wikipedia, their online entry titled Maurice Doreal states, in 1925, Doreal claimed to have visited the Great Pyramids of Giza, where he discovered a set of ancient emerald tablets belonging to the Egyptian deity Thoth, whom he reimagined as a king of Atlantis. Let's revisit the definition for reimagine. According to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, the word reimagine is defined as follows. Reimagine, to form a new conception of, to recreate, to imagine again, or imagine anew. For imagination's sake, let's take a look at Doreal's claims from his perspective. The truth is stranger than the science fiction it may be encoded within. If we were to take Doreal's claims at face value, in having channeled Thoth in his interpretation and translation of the Emerald Tablets, then we could imagine that this form of communication could have been accomplished through the electronic medium of the ether, so that the message of instruction would have traveled over the universal airwaves of telepathic communication, projecting over and across the expanse of time and space, so that in this instance, Thoth as communicator could be likened unto a master lectorius within the mental scriptorium of Doreal's mind. If you will recall the entry that we read from our source, History Stack Exchange, where they are cited as stating, the works have survived, however, because they were copied either by individual scholars or by being copied in mass in scriptoriums. In a scriptorium, a master reader, called a lectorius, would recite the word, and scribes would write it down as he spoke it. In other words, when Doreal claims to have channeled Thoth, one would have to imagine that he became a conduit, a vessel, an instrument, and a receiver of hyperdimensional communication that can be equated to the scribes and monks within the ancient scriptoriums who received readings of dictation from the master lectorius in their transcribing of ancient manuscripts and books. After all, we are told that we exist within an electric universe, and that the human body is bioelectric in nature. As the human body can be likened unto a tuning fork that can both receive and transmit thought forms by mentally broadcasting and projecting our thoughts into the thought space, we also possess the ability to attune ourselves to certain frequencies in order to tap into the universal consciousness and its collective pool of thought that we refer to as the Akashic Record. So there you have it. You be the judge. In so doing, take into consideration all of the information that has been presented within this work and form your own conclusions. And, on a final note, maybe the best way of hiding a great truth is to encode it within the literary science of fiction. The truth is out there. Anything is possible. This concludes Part 3, Subpart 2. Be sure to watch Part 4 of The Emerald Tablets of Thoth The Atlantean. Who is Maurice Doreal?